All right, everybody. The American West, why we went and what we found there. Sounds like I'm all full of energy, right? But I'm really at the tail end of either an awful cold or a minor strain of the flu or something like that. So my voice is not great. My respiratory energy is a little sketchy. But I'm going to keep myself going with Ricola, tea, water, and I'm going to power through. So, introduction. In America, it's always been about the West. The Doors knew it. Jim Morrison knew it, which is why in their magnum opus, The End, he sings, "The West is the best. The West is the best. Get here and we'll do the rest." Almost as if the West was the answer to everything, if only one could just get there. But it was the answer, or at least it seemed to be, and was painted, advertised, portrayed as such, even sang into being as such, all the way up into the early 21st century. The West was the place of release, reinvention, possibility, and opportunity. If America was the place where anything was possible, the West of America was the ultimate expression of that promise. Even before there was such a thing as America or American history, the West was the thing, because the British, the Dutch, the Spanish, all of the Europeans went west to get to the New World. And of course, this was a different song for the Native American, the Mexican American, for all of the folks that weren't white Americans. But that's a story for a little bit later. And right from the start of the colonial era, the colonies along the eastern seaboard were obsessed with the vast treasure trove of possibilities represented by the rest of the American continent, which, of course, lay west of them, beginning with Virginia, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, and then later the Carolinas and Georgia, and etc. They all laid claim to tremendous, enormous tracts of land beyond the Western Mountains that would later become pieces of such states as Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, Mississippi, and more. After all, what was the War for Independence about? Well, sure, no taxation without representation and all that jive. There's no question about it. But even before the colonists got irritated about all that, they were steamed about the British government telling them, no, jolly well not. You are not to go traipsing about in the Western Territories. If you do, it's a bloody good certainty you'll do nothing more than stir up trouble with the natives. And Indian wars are the last thing that we need, seeing as how, now that the French and Indian War is over, our national debt has increased 2,500%. That's a true story, guys. 2,500%. The national debt of England had gone up by the time the French and Indian War had come to an end in 1763, just 13 years before the War for Independence began. So let me keep going. Indian wars are bloody expensive, so by no means are you to be crossing those Appalachian mountains and mucking about with the Indians. And just to be sure you do not do this, we're laying down this proclamation line in 1763 to make it clear on the bloody map that this land to the east is yours and this land to the west is for the Indians. Okay, now let's dig the map, guys. Okay, we got two maps here. Right, here's the proclamation line. Okay, you can see it here on this map. Here's all the 13 original colonies, and here's the Western Territories, otherwise known as Indian Country, that all of the colonists were so keen to get their hands on, and that the British government wanted them to stay the hell out of. But from their point of view, the colonists, the French and Indian War, the whole point of it was so that they could get out there and get this land, right? Now, if you look at this map over here, you can see the lands that were claimed by the colonies back here. Like, look, here's Massachusetts, right? Now, out here is the land that Massachusetts had laid claim to going back more than 100 years. Here's the land that Connecticut, little bitty Connecticut here, had laid claim to, okay, for over 100 years, up into the 1760s, 150 years. This was land that they expected to go out and occupy, take over, make money off of. Now in 1763, the British government is saying, no, you're not crossing these mountains. You're not crossing this proclamation line. No, you can't have that land, Georgia, that you laid claim to, South Carolina, that North Carolina, Virginia, that all this land that the colonies always thought they were going to get a hold of. Now the British are saying, no, you can't have it. Okay? Well, I mean, really, from the colonial point of view, this was not just rude. It was downright uncool. So the colonists don't like this know-how. Okay? They did not dig it. And this played no small part in precipitating the bid for independence. Americans were crossing that line even before it was on the map. And they crossed the line during the War for Independence. And when the war was over, they were crossing the Appalachian Mountains in larger and larger numbers all the time. And before you could say lickety-split, new territories and states had been carved out of the western horizon all the way to the Mississippi, right? All the way out to here. You get Alabama, and you get Mississippi, and then you get Louisiana out here, and you get Tennessee, and you get Kentucky, and you get Ohio and Indiana, and you get Illinois, okay? And Americans started looking hungrily at the lands past the river, even further out to the west. Okay, and lots of Indian conflict came into play because of all these Americans heading out into these territories. And Americans just kept on heading west, more of them all the time and further west. Okay, with all kinds of things motivating them, the cotton lands of the Deep South and Texas and later California and its gold, all of these things as primary motivators. Okay, but there were other motivators as well, right? So before we get any further along here, let's quickly identify what historians like to refer to as the push and pull factors that were sending Americans into the West, okay? The things that were pushing them out of the East, so to speak, and at the same time pulling them into the West, okay? Push and pull factors. So first of all, land. Lots of land. Unbelievable amounts of real estate that could be used both for farming, okay, and for ranching, right? Next, mining possibilities. Digging down under the ground for mineral wealth. Gold is number one, always. Silver is number two. But there's all kinds of other minerals that are worth money. Copper comes next, and lots of other ones after that. But okay, mineral wealth. Number three, railroad development. Americans are going to want to create a truly national transportation network of railways. And that means moving into the West, opening up the real estate out there, and figuring out how and where those railroads can be laid out. Okay? And the fourth big thing we're going to need to talk about is manifest destiny. All right? And up here on the screen, you can see this very, very, very famous painting by Emmanuel Lutz that was done in the year that the Civil War began, 1861. The name of the painting is Westward, the course of empire takes its way. Here you see the opening of the San Francisco Bay, and here you see all these Americans moving forward into the West with their horses and their covered wagons. See the guys with their guns, right? And these guys up here saying, heading out west, and this guy pointing west, right? Sort of pointing the way off into the great untracked expanse of the unknown, right? The whole suggestion of this painting is this is where the American empire is moving into the West because it's our manifest destiny. But we'll get to that shortly, okay? Now, here's another great painting by David Wright. This goes back a little bit further, 1775, right before the War for Independence is going to break out. The great Western frontiersman, hunter, scout Daniel Boone leading settlers through the Cumberland Gap, which is an opening that cuts through the Appalachian Mountains, okay, into Kentucky, right? So here you have Daniel Boone leading all these settlers with their livestock and their dogs and everything. The men got all their guns out just in case there's Indian trouble or whatever, right? Anyway, Daniel Boone leading this party of settlers into the territory, what would later be the state of Kentucky. Really gorgeous, extraordinary painting, right? And okay, so here we come into the first section of the lecture, which is the pacification of the West. Let me get a drink of water here before we get into this, guys. 2 seconds. Okay, pardon me. If you dip into books on American history written between the late 1800s and the 1950s and 60s, right around there, you're going to inevitably run across the phrase, the pacification of the West. Nice, right? We made the West peaceful, which is what pacification means. Because, of course, before that, it was the Wild West. And it needed to be calmed down, cooled, chilled out, needed to be made peaceful. This is a phrase I'm sure you've heard at some point in your life, even if you're, on the younger side. Hell, there was an enormously popular TV show back in the late 1960s called The Wild Wild West. Here's an advertisement for it over here down in the lower left-hand corner. The Wild Wild West, the star of which was Robert Conrad, who played Jim West, which is this guy in the blue suit here, with his beautiful Winchester rifle here, and his sidekick. What was this dude's name? Oh, come on now. Artemus Gordon. Okay, yeah, that was his right-hand man. Artemus Gordon, played by Ross Martin. Okay, so, the Wild Wild West. And that helps me to make my point. Okay, that show was about white guys, secret agents of the federal government out west doing what had to be done to pacify things. They stopped bank robbers, they stopped trains being held up, they took care of range wars, bad guys, whatever needed to be done in the wild, wild west. They took care of business, all right? White men in the service of American empire. Now, lots of movies and TV shows played out this theme over the years and decades. However, when the movie remake of The Wild Wild West was done in 1999, then it had a sequel, there was 2 of them, but the first one, 1999, Will Smith, big movie star at that point, early in his career, already a stud though, he was the African-American lead who played, excuse me, the lead star, okay, Jim West, and Kevin Kline played his sidekick Artemus Gordon, and then there was a third co-star added, played by Salma Hayek, okay, a Latina. So here you got a whole different sort of ball game, right? You've got a black guy playing the lead. You've got a Latina playing. She was basically sort of like on the same level, let's say, in terms of screen time and whatever, as Kevin Kline. You could almost hear Bob Dylan singing, "Oh, the times they are a-changing" in the background. Because, yeah, it's a whole different period in American history and the history of the movies and Hollywood. American society has changed dramatically. You know, people don't want to see a direct remake of the Wild Wild West with two white guys doing everything. People want to see something a little bit different. And so this notion of the pacifying of the Wild West, because honestly, was it a pacification, making things more peaceful? Or was it a conquest, which made things more peaceful, let's face it, but isn't that like a more, let's say, honest way of putting things? I mean, it was certainly made more peaceful, but only by way of using lots of violence to conquer an awful lot of Indians who were not thrilled about the situation. So let's consider the question of why go to the West anyway? After all, the territory the United States owned east of the Mississippi River was larger than all of Europe combined. So, I mean, wasn't that enough? Well, no. And it had not been enough, not since Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana Purchase way back in 1803. Jefferson had a dream. He dreamed of, and this is his quote, "land for 100 generations of yeoman farmers." Enough land so that 100 generations of citizen farmers would be able to have a farm of their own. I mean, 100 generations, that's like 40 centuries or something like that. I mean, we're only like 2 centuries away from then, and we've already run out of enough land for that pretty much. But okay, that was Jefferson's dream, okay? And besides, there was always a sense that in America there would never be really enough room, that every man should have as much room as he wanted or could afford, and into which he could expand. So, well, why not keep moving west, keep getting more land? I mean, could there ever really be enough land? No. Get more land for all of those sons and daughters yet to be born in the future? Yeah. I mean, after all, the only thing in the way was the Indians. And they had already proven to be not much of an obstacle at all, really. I mean, Americans had proven themselves pretty good at beating up on the Indians, let's say. And this is not, your faithful professor placing a stamp of approval on that or saying he agrees with that process, that historical process. I'm just saying that that's just the way things had played out. In addition, due to extremely complicated ideas about the different strands of humanity going back many, many centuries, which had become inextricably woven into the context of modern racism that was created by the demands of New World economics and slavery, Native Americans' needs or rights were not really taken into consideration by the vast majority of Americans. And that majority became even greater when the harsh demands of survival on the Western frontier factored into play. To say that the pacification of the West was wildly successful is really to understate the reality of the matter. It not only accelerated the movement of Americans from east to west, it also inspired enormous numbers of northwestern Europeans to emigrate from countries that had, at that time, not really been sources of immigration for the United States. Okay? So, the countries of Scandinavia, in particular, would fill up the northern Great Plains with, quite literally, entire villages of people that relocated into such territories and states as Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and the Dakotas in particular. Okay, we're talking about this area in here, Nebraska to a lesser degree, Montana to a lesser degree, and we're talking again about Scandinavian countries. So we're talking about Denmark, or the Danish, yeah, right? A smidgen of Icelanders. Poquito, just a little. Yeah, lots of Norwegians, right, from Norway. Swedes from Sweden. Okay, lots and lots. Doesn't really mention it on here, but the minuto, okay, of Finns. Little tiny bit of people from Finland, so small that they don't even put them on here. Okay, but look at this, guys. You can read the map here in terms of population density and everything. You can see an extraordinary number of Scandinavians right up in here, right? The further north it is, the colder it is. I like that, right? Okay, and then a little less where it's a little less green, a little less green. You guys can read the map. You don't read maps like this. So you can see this. And think of what we're talking about here again. We're talking about the middle part of the 1800s, actually after the midpoint, the 1860s, 70s, 80s in there. These are not people that populated the older part of the United States, really. I mean, like a smidgen in here. But for the most part, back here, the earlier part of American history, no. The Scandinavians started coming later into this part of the country. Out here, it's a very different phenomenon, a very different point in time in American history in terms of our immigration story. All right. Now, agriculture and ranching. Even as the Civil War was being fought, 1860s, Congress passed the Homestead Act in 1862. Sorry about that slurping. Which allowed for 160 acres of free land to any man, or a woman, actually, could be a woman, okay, who settled down on that land, unclaimed land, of course, right? Nobody else had a claim on it, in the Western territories or states for 5 years, okay? You had to go out to this chunk of real estate, lay a claim to it, and a land office, okay? Live there for 5 years and improve it, which meant work it, farm it, build a place there to live, okay? In other words, you make that land yours in a visible, demonstrable way. It was hoped that this law would attract settlers to the West, and it did. Over 2.5 million farms popped up within a decade between 1862 and 1872, and then more later. It slowed down some, but in that first decade, 2.5 million farms sprang up, and so successful was this as a way of spurring economic development that the Canadian government copied it shortly thereafter to attract settlers to their northern part of the Great Plains, right? This is the part of the United States that we refer to as the Great Plains. And here, well, if you just go north of this line into Canada, it's the same kind of real estate. They have the Great Plains too, right? Up in their part of the country. Well, they did something just like the Homestead Act to create the same sort of phenomenon in their country. So if you look at this map, you close in on it, you can read and see where there are towns, forts, missions, etc. You can see the way, the railroads are being expanded into the west or extended into the west, main roads, trails. You can see how slowly but surely development is being expanded into the west. Okay? Now here we have, that map that I just showed you, and then a map which shows more and later development in the same pattern, let's say, a little further down the line, okay? And you can pause here and look at this. I'm not going to just sit here and go and start it with you. Okay, I'll allow you to on your own, okay? Now, a little bit further along with this same premise, in the same year, 1862, the year that the Civil War is really heating up. I mean, it starts in 1861, but 1862, the Department of Agriculture was established and the Morrill Act was passed, which set aside 140 million acres of federal land, okay? Land that is not owned by the states, not owned by anyone in terms of private individuals, owned by the federal government, that states could then sell to raise the money for public universities, which became known as land-grant colleges. Colleges that were established by way of these land grants. Okay? Land-grant college. It was stipulated that no state which was currently rebelling, hint, hint, the South, Civil War, against the United States government could benefit from this law. But once the Civil War came to an end, the southern states were allowed to fund African American colleges for freed slaves, okay? And these became some of the first of the historically black colleges and universities in the country, which are often referred to as HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities. Okay, you may have seen that acronym somewhere. Maybe you didn't know what it meant, but that's what it is, all right? Now, homesteaders came to the West in droves. They staked their claims to land. They found the soil both deep and fertile. European immigrants brought a new strain of hard kernel wheat that was better able to deal with the extremes of temperature in the Great Plains. The movements of cattle were controlled by this groovy new invention called barbed wire. Yeah, if you can dig that, this is when barbed wire was invented. There was even a movement of former slaves that came from the states of the Deep South, where slavery had just been done away with, right, to escape the endemic racism, violence, and poverty. These former slaves are called the exodusters. There was about 30,000 of them. They emigrated out of the South and arrived in Kansas between 1879 and 1890. Very quickly here, I want you to dig this graphic. Here you've got a map that shows you where the land-grant colleges and universities popped up all around the country. Here with the red dot, those were established in 1862. A little bit later, White Star, 1890. Even somewhat later, as late as 1994, if you can dig that. But pretty cool, right? You can check out this map again. You can check it out, pause, and kind of dig into it a little bit. But anyway, yeah, the land-grant colleges. Now, talking about the exodusters, increasingly, many historians have classified the exodusters as refugees due to the ongoing challenges of life in the South post-Civil War and Reconstruction. The general hostility of the overwhelming majority of the white population toward the former slaves and outright terrorism practiced against them by extremist white supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan had made day-to-day life in the South a matter of survival, okay? I mean, they were not living by our definition of the word. They were just doing their best to survive Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, day after day, week after week. Their lives were a veil of horror and misery in the South. So, a conference was called. Ultimately, it came to be known as the Colonization Council. And African American delegates from 6 southern states, former slave states, they met in New Orleans in 1875 to discuss the best plan of action going forward. Should we emigrate to Liberia in Western Africa? Okay, a colony that had been set up by the American Colonization Society as a place where former slaves could go and begin new lives, going back to Africa, okay? Leave America, go back to Africa. Do we want to go there? Or should they, pick up their belongings, so to speak, pack up their stuff, and leave the South and head out into the Western territories. All right. Now, the movement had several charismatic leaders, among them Henry Adams, fairly well known, but the most important of them was this noble-looking chap that you see down here at the lower left-hand corner of your screen, Benjamin Pap Singleton, usually, referred to as Pap. That was his nickname, Pap, Papa, Father, okay? Benjamin Pap Singleton, a former slave who in 1846, at the age of 37, escaped from slavery to Canada by way of the legendary Underground Railroad. Within a short time, he crossed back into Detroit, Michigan, where he lived until 1862, the next, 16 years, okay? Perfectly okay, safe and everything, no problems. Then moved to Tennessee, which had been restored to the Union at that point by U.S. forces. Tennessee, by fall of 1862, had been pulled out of the Confederacy, so to speak, conquered by the Union, and was no longer under control of the Confederates. So he returned, to Tennessee, and there he established an organization called the Edgefield Real Estate and Homestead Association. And the purpose of it was to help freedmen, former slaves, acquire land. Okay? He had become worn out with the lack of what he felt was, let's say, true effort on the part of the Reconstruction authorities in that area in terms of helping freedmen get land, to farm and support themselves. And so he decided that freedmen had to help themselves. And so he wanted to create an organization to sort of to promote that and to assist in that effort. In 1878, he led the first group of African Americans westward to Kansas, where he had already gone and come back, and he'd already scouted lands that were available for homestead claims under the Homestead Act. And he became an instrumental figure of leadership the following year in the Exoduster movement. Okay. In 1880, he would testify before Congress, right, before the federal government, as to the horrific situation in the South for African Americans and as to the need for this movement, for the Exoduster movement. He actually asked for funds from Congress. Of course, they didn't come up with any. But anyway, he did his best to try to get the federal government, to, help finance westward migration for freedmen. Anyway, but that was later. By 1879, Liberia had been rejected as far too costly a venture. The cost of just crossing the Atlantic Ocean and everything was like, no, there's no way we can do this. And Kansas, due to its long-standing reputation as a defender of the traditions of anti-slavery and freedom, had been selected as the future home of those who would come to be known as the Exodusters. Many of these immigrants would settle in the towns of Kansas, but the majority became homesteaders, despite the difficulty in making a living as farmers in the hardscrabble uplands of Kansas. Approximately 20,000 freedmen arrived between 1879 and 1880, and perhaps as many as 10,000 more African Americans arrived during the following decade. Now, if you check out this poster, like, this is an example of one of the advertisements that tried to rally the spirits of freedmen to get involved in the movement, right? Ho for Kansas, brethren, friends, and fellow citizens. I feel thankful to inform you that the real estate and homestead situation will leave here on the 15th of April, 1878, in pursuit of homes in the southwestern lands of America, et cetera, and so on. Benjamin Singleton, better known as Old Pap, he's going to lead the movement, and blah, 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 right? So, where's the idea? Here's some images, okay, an engraving from Harper's Weekly, 1870, one of the most popular periodicals of the day. And then here you have a photograph. Best kind of clarity I could get I found a lot of different versions of the image, and this is the clearest one that I could get. There's some actual exodusters here, taking a break, pausing, in their travels and on their way out to Kansas. Now, let's talk about the women. I talked about how women could homestead, and indeed, somewhere between 5 and 20% of all homestead claims were filed by women. Often women whose brother, uncle, or sister had the next parcel of land. Thus, family members supported one another through difficult times. Difficulties were many and sometimes insurmountable. Prairie fires, right? The long grass could be lit on fire because of dry lightning, or just lightning from any particular time. Hailstorms, either one of these things could ruin your entire year's crop one day, right? You spend all season like raising up whatever it is, wheat, whatever you're growing, corn, and then it all gets burned down, or there's a big hailstorm, it's wiped out. So, the whatever amount of money you were hoping to make for that year to pay off the debt that you incurred and the money that you were hoping to make for the next year and whatever, it's all gone. Nothing is more, how can I put it? There was no way to make a living that dangled by a thread, okay, more treacherously than farming. There would be like plagues, almost like biblical plagues of grasshoppers, locusts, okay, that could wipe out your crop. Blizzards, tornadoes, fun. Basic survival could be made challenging in some areas due to the scarcity of water and wood. In the late 1880s, more than 50,000 homesteaders fled North and South Dakota territories alone. How many fled the other different areas? I'm not sure, but I do have that one statistic. New wisdom began to emerge. The farming practices, okay, the manner of farming that worked really well east of the Mississippi, okay, in Illinois, Alabama, Georgia, Virginia, Massachusetts, everywhere east of the Mississippi, those farming practices did not work west of the Mississippi in all these areas where people were doing this homesteading. And 160 acres was too darn big for a small family farm. It was a great size for a big corporate farm that a business would operate, but that's for the future and big investments of capital, okay? Some of you might be going, man, I don't even know what an acre is. And how big is 160 acres? Okay, now I'm going to guess that most of you are in Southern California because you're in my class, so you're probably from the LA area, OC area, Southern California. Most of you have been to Disneyland, okay? Disneyland, the original Magic Kingdom, okay? So forget about California Great Adventure Park. Forget that. Disneyland and its parking lot is 60 acres. So if you multiply that by about 3, make that 3 times bigger, roughly that's 180 acres. That's about as much land as you would get under the Homestead Act. Now, can you imagine one guy and his wife and his couple of kids farming all that land and trying to do that themselves? I mean, that's an unbelievable amount of land. I mean, honestly, I can't imagine farming as much land like the size of my bedroom. It seems like, I mean, I'm worn out just doing this, what I'm doing right now. Farming? No, forget it. No, not into it. So, yeah, this lady right here, it says a homestead woman and her daughter farming corn. To me, it looks like the daughter's just sitting there. This lady is, is doing the back-breaking labor, right? Not the daughter, but yeah, farming. Good Lord. Okay. Now, at this time, a truly remarkable American, John Wesley Powell, thinker, explorer, scientist, bureaucrat, and one-armed Civil War veteran. You know, see how the sleeve? No arm in there, right? Empty, okay? This guy was rambling all over the West, exploring, writing, cogitating, thinking hard, and being the first white man to lead an expedition by water all the way down the Colorado River and through the Grand Canyon, man. This dude was badass, okay? He was commissioned by Congress to produce this thing that ultimately he entitled Report on the Lands of the Arid Region of the United States. Arid, of course, means dry. Okay? A report on the dry area of the United States. He had this done by 1879, and if you look at the map here, okay, so here's the Mississippi River, about here. Here's the greenish, wetter areas of the United States up here in the Pacific Northwest. And guys, all this part of the country is pretty dry, okay? But he wasn't out here on the California coast and stuff. He was writing about this area in here. Traveled all around here, okay? So, in his report, he said, these 160-acre farms will flat out not work in these dry areas of the West. He had seen firsthand the success that the Mormons were having in Utah with their big irrigation projects, okay? And he told the government, this is what you got to do. You got to put together a ton of money, and you've got to invest the capital necessary for dams and canals to properly irrigate the arid regions of the West. Now, some of these congressmen, they were smart enough to know smart thinking when they read it and when they heard him testify about it. And they said, yeah, we get it. However, the majority, for a wide variety of reasons, they said, no. Okay. I mean, he was correct, 100%. Okay. And in the long run, decades later, in the 20th century, these sort of water control projects would be put into place in the West, and the federal government will pay for it. And it'll be one of the best things the federal government ever does in the history of the country. Okay? Smart. He knew this is what needed to be done. But back then, the majority of people in Congress were simply not willing to listen to this kind of reasoning. All right? But Powell knew way ahead of time that this is what had to happen. Look at this dude. Doesn't he just look like a badass? I mean, who you got? I wouldn't have argued with him. I would have just said, right, no, go away. You're giving me nightmares, dude. You scare me. Okay. Here's a memorial to John Wesley Powell, right? One-armed, standing there with his oar, that he used to help navigate going down the Colorado River. Very cool, I think, right? Real testimonial to how tough this guy was and everything. John Wesley Powell. Awesome. Now, we also need to briefly consider the importance of ranching and the cattleman. Okay? The American cowboy is perhaps the single most iconic image that means American in the minds of people all around the world. Because there was nothing quite like our cowboys in any other country's history, symbolizing, as they do, the spirit of freedom, individualism, and heroic manliness a product largely the result of the westerns that Hollywood has been pumping out since the earliest days of the movie industry. Indeed, one of the first noteworthy motion pictures was a western, The Great Train Robbery, made back in 1903. Okay, starring Tom Mix. Here's Tom Mix, photo of Tom Mix. There's Tom Mix off to the side. However, that cowboy culture of the Wild West was one of the most fleeting periods, like don't blink or you'll miss it, in American history, lasting only about 25 years, from 1865, the end of the Civil War, until the closing of the frontier, about 1890. It was during this time that the ranching culture of the West and Southwest spread wide, and the great cattle drives began. A very specifically Spanish ranching culture predated this, originating in the late 1500s and early 1600s in the Southwest. But the new Anglo-American culture would be very different. Now, these cowboys come in all shapes and sizes. And again, most of what we know, or what we think we know, about cowboy culture comes from Hollywood. Right? Here you've got John Wayne and his classic film Hondo. You've got Clint Eastwood in the reinvention of the cowboy culture in the movies, the spaghetti westerns of the 1960s, where he played the man with no name. And here you've got the great Quentin Tarantino film Django Unchained, starring Jamie Foxx as this awesome, badass black cowboy. And then this animated western with the Johnny Depp voiced I started to say Django Unchained again. Rango rhymes with Django, right? Cowboys come in all shapes and sizes, and they do all sorts of things for us, serve all sorts of purposes. Okay. The American cowboy was such a big deal and so well known worldwide, even way before there was any such thing as a moving picture, even before there was such a thing as a camera, that one of the most famous figures from the Old West, Buffalo Bill Cody, the great Western scout and buffalo hunter, he put together a thing kind of like a circus, okay, called Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show, that had all these cowboys and Indians and trick riders and trick shooters. And he took this thing touring all the way back through the cities of the East. And it was like going to the circus or Cirque du Soleil or whatever. You paid, you went into this big tent and you saw all these like crazy, shows that went on, and all this like people, shooting and riding and doing all this crazy stuff. And then he took it off to Europe. Every country in Europe played before every king, every queen. I mean, it was like the biggest thing you could imagine, the most spectacular thing in the world. And his likeness and his name branded every kind of thing in the world. Like any kind of thing you could think of buying, his name and face was on it. He made money off it. Buffalo Bill was it. Everybody knew this guy all around the world in the same way that nowadays everybody knows Michael Jordan, okay, or Beyonce, or whatever kind of famous celebrity you want to name. That was Buffalo Bill Cody back in the late 1800s and into the early 20th century, okay. Cowboys were used and still are used to sell everything. Here's an advertisement from the Saturday Evening Post, the most popular magazine for a large part of the 20th century. So here are cowboys being used to sell cars, Dodge automobiles, way back in the early 20th century. Here's one of the greatest pitchers of Major League Baseball in the early 1970s being used to sell BVD underwear, but dressed up like a cowboy, right? All this accoutrement of the cowboy life. The guy's a baseball player. Here you have the Irish beer Guinness, okay, being dressed up, let's say, in the trade dress and accoutrement of Clint Eastwood's spaghetti westerns. The first of those spaghetti westerns was called A Fistful of Dollars. So here's Clint, the poster for the movie, and you can see how this advertisement for Guinness beer has been turned out to look like a movie poster for one of Clint's, or specifically this movie, A Fistful of Dollars, right? And here, Ronald Reagan, running for president the second time in 1984, co-opted the cowboy for his image, America, Reagan country, with these images of America, Mount Rushmore, the Statue of Liberty, the New York skyline, the White House, all kind of like in this sort of ghostly images behind him. Okay. The Marlboro Man was this cowboy figure that was used to advertise cigarettes, Marlboro cigarettes, for many, many years on billboards everywhere, with the little warning down here. Warning, the Surgeon General has determined that cigarette smoking is dangerous to your health. Wow, gosh, no, really, you think so? Yeah, but he's so good looking and it looks so cool and it's so sexy and etc. Well, at a certain point, it became illegal to advertise cigarettes and smoking like this, and that's why you don't see these billboards anymore. First, they said you can't do this within X number of feet, X number of distance of schools. We don't want kids to see these kind of advertisements. And then ultimately, no advertising anywhere at all. There is no longer any outdoor advertising of cigarettes. But before that even happened, you had these kind of billboards going up where you had these cowboys and, hey, Bob, I've got emphysema, and this little advisory saying, smoking gives you cancer and kills you dead, basically. So, over the course of a century, things shifted. Cowboys and the use of cowboys in advertising, let's say, described a sort of arc in terms of what they could be used for, or what purpose could be made of them, let's say. And I'm sure that they're going to evolve even more in other directions, different directions, as time goes on and we rethink and reinvent the cowboy. Now, to continue talking about the ranching, and in the West, I talked about how there was a Spanish ranching culture in the West, but then this specifically American ranching culture was something different, modeled to a large degree on the Tejano ranches of South Texas. By the late 1860s, Anglo-American cattlemen held approximately 5 million head of longhorn cattle. At the same time, the railroad reached Sedalia, Missouri, and not long after, Abilene and Dodge City, Kansas, 3 different spots. Easterners were crazy for beef, and a $3 steer in Texas would sell for $35 to $40 at the railhead in Missouri or Kansas, which means that beef back east would sell for $80, $100, $200 or something like that. I'm not sure how much, but obviously a huge markup from there. Roughly a dozen cowboys could drive several thousand cattle on the long drive north, and the saloons, streets, and brothels of the towns named above would be filled at certain times of the year with cowboys who had money in their pockets and were looking for fun and women, drinks and cards, and were ready for whatever degree of violence that might come their way, be it from a pair of fists or the barrel of a gun. Okay, so now if you look at these 2 maps, guys, what you had down on here were these unbelievable herds of cattle. 5 million cows down on here, on all different size ranches. The red lines show the routes that were taken on the long drives north up to where the railway lines were located. Okay, and this is another map that shows them going, that just shows a slightly different iteration of this. Okay, but again, the railroad lines up here, you can look at these again a little bit differently. Here's Sedalia, Missouri. Here's, Abilene, Kansas. Dodge City is going to be, there's Dodge City. You can check out the maps, pause if you want, pour over in a little bit, but you get the idea. Cattle, an unbelievable resource in the West. The land, the cattle on the land, the railroads connecting to them, bibbity bobbity boo, right? Oh, here's some photographs from Hollywood movies where they recreated these long drives, right, to try to give an air of verisimilitude to the films. All right, it's not an actual long drive, except that it kind of is, I mean, except that they're not doing it to make money off the cows. They're doing it to make money off the movie, where they're showing you what a long drive looked like. All right, the most famous movie ever made about one of these long drives was a Howard Hawks film called Red River. Extraordinary film. There was glory at one end, fury at the other, and nothing but danger in between. Red River. Yeah, take it. It's a great movie if you like westerns. Anyway, so these cow towns became the stuff of literally thousands of books, a little bit smaller than the small-sized paperbacks that you think of as like a paperback you could hold in your hands very easily, okay? They were called dime novels because they cost how much? A dime. And the imaginations of Americans and people around the world were fired by the exploits of such legendary lawmen and outlaws as Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, okay? Portrayed in the film Tombstone by Kurt Russell and Val Kilmer, and portrayed in many other movies by many other famous actors. So, Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, Bass Reeves, and Wild Bill Hickok. And it's important to note, the dime novels dramatically exaggerated and romanticized much of the exploits of these larger-than-life figures of the West, and this was later amplified even more by Hollywood. The long drives were ended once the railway lines reached Texas, and as they penetrated deeper into the northern Great Plains, the use of barbed wire and hay for feed, as opposed to naturally growing long grass, allowed northern cattlemen to compete with the ranches of Texas. Okay, here you have the real lawman, Bass Reeves. Okay, here you have the real lawman and gunfighter, Wild Bill Hickok. Jeff Bridges played Wild Bill Hickok in a great film called Wild Bill, and David O'Leo, played Bass Reeves in a TV series that was out 2 or 3 years ago and is still streaming on Paramount. You can check it out. It was really good. I saw it. Anyway, can you dig it? Okay, now let's talk about mining, mineral wealth. There's gold in them thar hills. Or should I cry it out? Do I have enough chest energy? Probably not. There's gold in them thar hills. With that Missouri accent. This was supposedly what somebody yelled in a crowded intersection in San Francisco in 1848, breaking the news of the discovery of gold in Coloma, California. And the gold rush was officially on because people went, what? Tell me more about it. And then people began to charge out there and look for gold. And more people found out. And pretty soon, people from all around the country, especially back east, headed to California to get gold. Except, not really. The line actually came from an 1892 novel by Mark Twain. And then it was introduced into the broader popular culture by way of a Bugs Bunny cartoon called 14 Karat Rabbit, wherein gold prospector Yosemite Sam is dumbstruck by Bugs Bunny's ability to locate astonishingly large nuggets of gold. See this thing here? It's Bugs who gives voice to the famous shout when he staggers in with a nugget the size of an ottoman, like he comes walking in the door right before this, trying to carry this thing, and he said, there's gold in them there hills, and Yosemite Sam's like, hey! All that said, nonetheless, yeah, gold was there all right, and there was a pile of it, enough gold for everyone, as it turned out, and not just there, but all over California. Our motto, after all, is the Golden State, and not for nothing. Okay, just look at this map over here, guys. Every little golden dot is somewhere in California where people found gold, enough gold in the ground to make it worth mentioning. Okay. Now, here's San Francisco, and the area of the real gold rush was all up in here. So you can see, holy shnikes, right? I mean, this is like, yeah. Okay. But I mean, look at this. There's a ton up here and all through the state, man. California was chock full of gold, right? There was just an unbelievable lot of gold. Okay. However, all good things come to an end. And by the late 1850s, the gold in that one main area for the gold rush was pretty well petered out. So the most diehard of the prospectors spread out hither and yon, looking for other mineral wealth, and they found it, a lot of it. And here and there, you had rushes, okay? Gold rush, silver rush means people rushed, charged, took off to get there and get rich, okay? You had rushes of various shapes and sizes. The largest one that followed the California gold rush was the Comstock Lode in Nevada, which birthed an entirely new town in 1859 that grew into Virginia City. Look at the map here, guys. See it here? Virginia City, right there. Population 25,000 souls in 1875. As I write this in 2024, there are 721 people living in Virginia City. Okay? Not a lot of people nowadays. Once there were 100 saloons, 100 bars, man. A whole street of brothels. I assume that you guys know what a brothel is. That's a place where there's women who will have sex for money, right? Okay? And 2 men for every woman, okay? Women outnumbered the men 2-1. But then the silver ran out, and like every boom town, Virginia City became a ghost town. To fire folks up in relation to the search for mineral wealth, the General Mining Act of 1872 was passed, after which passage it was lawful to keep anything found and dug up on federally owned land. All you need to do is file a $5 per acre claim fee, and you are in business. And you can still do this today, right now, tomorrow, if you want. And I have a friend who does it on a weekly basis up in Big Bear Mountain, near his cabin. He's got a cabin up there. He has filed on a couple of acres, and he goes out there and he digs for gold. Okay? He has actually found some. Not enough to make it worth wasting his time as far as I'm concerned, but he thinks he's going to make some money at some point, so God love him, he enjoys it. Sounds great. However, now, to get at 99% of the real mineral wealth that is underneath the ground, a great deal of capital investment is needed to get way down in there. Okay, and there were corporations willing to do this, and they employed a lot of men. And these big mining works required a lot of lumber and a lot of food to feed the workers. And all of this came out of the developed Pacific Northwest, or most of it, stimulating even more growth there. I'm talking about Washington and Oregon here, okay? As well as the railroads, okay? And this would drive a major lumber industry into being, right? Lots and lots of lumber mills, trees being chopped down, trees being turned into planks and beams and all the things needed to shore up the tunnels of mines being dug deep down into the grounds and so on and so forth, okay? Now, let's look at this map right quick, okay? So, this color, gold mining, gold, right? Okay, now this color in here, this whole strip of real estate, a little bit over here, gold, silver, lead, copper. The pink area, gold, silver, copper, iron. Okay, and wherever you see this little triangle, silver bonanza. So Tombstone, Arizona, Santa Rita, New Mexico, the Comstock Lode, Silver City, Idaho, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and etc. You can dig it. you can make sense of the map. It doesn't take a rocket scientist. Okay, now as far as that, oh, well, here, I forgot about this picture. Here's Virginia City nowadays. Pretty happening, right? Looks like a party city. Yeah. About 720 people live there. I wouldn't want to live there. I'm sure it's a perfectly nice place, but no thanks. I don't think there's many bookstores there, and that is important to me. So, first off, forest loss in the United States over time. Let's talk about timber industries. 1850, just before all of this starts happening. Look up in here at how green things are. Then look here, and at first glance you might think there's no change, but you can definitely see the change if you really look. Okay, the green starts getting thinned out, not because so many people live here, but because of railroad development, mining development, and also because of people living there. But it's not just because of that. It's also to feed those industries. All right. And then over here, closed mining operations of the United States. All these dots represent places where we dug in there for mineral wealth, dug it all out, and it's all done. Copper, gold, iron, lead, lead and zinc, uranium, silver, zinc and lead, and then some other thing that there's not enough room to mention it. It's maybe kind of piddling, but dig it, guys. And especially dig it like this. East of the Mississippi. West of the Mississippi. Especially with the gold. Look at all that gold, man. Wow, baby, can you dig it? Look at all that gold. Okay. Not to mention silver. Almost no silver back here. Basically non-existent. Some gold, but none of this was like a big strike. Nothing. Okay. The big gold strikes out here. All the silver really out here. Okay. So, and one more. Critical mineral resources in the U.S. today. You can read it. You can dig it. Check it out. We're still getting tremendous mineral wealth out of our country, and especially out of the West, even as I speak. Okay, so I am going to stop right here for the moment, and we will pick this up in part 2 of the lecture.